Kevin Durant has been traded to the Phoenix Suns in exchange for Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, Jay Crowder, 4 first-round picks, and a pick swap. This is an unbelievable development right at the trade deadline. There's so many stories to talk about here, but first we have to begin with Phoenix and what their roster now looks like after acquiring Kevin Durant. There's a reason that this was a place that Kevin Durant wanted to go to, going back to his trade request this past offseason. There's 2 big reasons for this now. One, playing alongside Devin Booker, Chris Paul, and they keep DeAndre Ayton in this deal as well. They already have one of, if not the most formidable starting lineups in the entire league. They're going to be at the top of the list for a lot of teams in terms of buyout players, in terms of bringing guys in to fill out the rest of this roster now that they've moved so many of these wings. But if they can figure out one other guy in the starting lineup that can space alongside this group, this is going to be an unbelievable team, specifically offensively. But then having Ayton, I think, is a huge deal for them to have a big man there that they can help, have protect the rim, do all the rebounding stuff, all the stuff that Brooklyn never really had up until this year when Nick Claxton started playing really well. And KD alongside Booker and then Chris Paul and Ayton pick and roll at the end of games as well. They're going to be an unbelievable offensive team if they can figure it out defensively. This is a fantastic trade for Phoenix. And I think the other thing that changed from going back to last offseason to now is Brooklyn being more willing to trade Kevin Durant, but also the new owner in Phoenix really pushed to make this happen over the last 12 to 16 hours, including Mikal Bridges in the trade, gave Brooklyn everything they possibly could in this deal with the exception of a few other pick swaps in order to make the KD trade happen. And it's interesting timing for a team that has been struggling a little bit this year, dealing with injury issues and things like that. Obviously, they make the finals a couple years ago. They have the playoff collapse last year. Bringing in someone like Durant is the last piece of the puzzle for them, certainly. Elevates them to the top tier of Western Conference contenders, and interestingly, changes the landscape around the Western Conference, which is something that we're going to talk about a little bit later. For Brooklyn, obviously, in any scenario like this, whether it be the Anthony Davis trade, whether it be a Kevin Durant trade like this, you're never going to get adequate value in exchange for someone as good as a player as Kevin Durant. Like, you might cobble together something that remotely resembles Kevin Durant level of value, but as an individual player, you're never going to get remotely close to what Durant provides to you. And in this case, like I said, Brooklyn got everything that Phoenix could trade. KD wanted to go to Phoenix, and it's clear that it's not that the Nets just gave up or gave in, but they were ready to move on from this entire experiment, going back to Kyrie requesting a trade just a few days ago. Obviously, they traded Harden the year before, and Durant, going back to his trade request last offseason, didn't want to be in Brooklyn, wanted to be elsewhere. To KD's credit, he was locked in and focused on the Nets season this year. It just didn't work out the way that either him or the team wanted to, given his injury and all that different stuff. And now he finds himself in the place that he always wanted to be, and that is Phoenix. Brooklyn getting back a couple young players like Cam Johnson, Mikal Bridges is critical. It's important for them in terms of the future of the franchise. You get these first-round picks as well, but it's important. You're going to see a lot of people over the next couple of days say that the Nets got really good value in exchange for Durant, and they're set up well moving forward, and they're going to be successful moving forward. That might very well be the case. We'll talk about that in a second. But to be clear, you never, ever get the same level of value in exchange for players like Kevin Durant, even though, yes, they got a couple of young players and they got picks in exchange for a guy that's 34, tore his Achilles a couple of years ago and has gotten injured in the middle of the year each of the last couple of seasons. That's really good value, but you're never going to get quite what Durant provided to you as an individual player. Moving forward for Brooklyn, they now have these 4 Phoenix picks. They have the pick swap in 2028 with them. They have the Dallas pick they got in the Kyrie trade. They have the Philly pick that they got in the Simmons trade last year. And then they still own, I think, one of their first-round picks. If they wanted to make some other kinds of moves, it looks like they're going to try and move Jay Crowder at the deadline as well to try and get some additional draft compensation in exchange for him. And now, very clearly, this is a rebuild in Brooklyn. They're going to try and figure out what they can do with Simmons. Now they've got Finney-Smith and Dinwiddie, and then they've got these wings as well. It's a bit of a weird and an interesting team. It's completely the opposite of what they've had in the entirety of the KD, Kyrie, Harden era, where they were so small all the time. Now they're like this giant team with all these random different wings. And of course, they have to contend with the fact that they owe all these future first-round picks to Houston. But this construction of a deal, I think, checks a couple of boxes for Brooklyn, despite the fact that obviously you're trading away one of the best players in the league. It allows them to remain at least relatively competitive at the moment. They're not a completely awful team as long as they can figure out a way to score, which means that they're not going to be giving away top 5 picks to Houston for the next couple of seasons. And they have these draft picks as well to continue to add talent around guys like, Cam Thomas, Simmons, these 2 wings, Finney-Smith, all those different kinds of guys. Claxton, a really interesting mix of talent here in Brooklyn. It is also worth noting at this point that every single pick that Brooklyn got in this trade is unprotected from Phoenix, and one of them goes all the way until 2029. And KD's 34, Chris Paul is in his late 30s. Yes, Devin Booker and DeAndre Ayton are still there, but there is some level of risk associated here for Phoenix with trading for an older player, all these future first-round picks. And then for Brooklyn, as well as we've seen with a number of teams over the years, there's always the possibility that those picks become a complete gold mine if one of these teams falls apart. That's a situation that Brooklyn is also now in, whether it be with Phoenix or with Houston. Houston fans, I'm sure, are anxiously anticipating what they're going to get now out of those future Brooklyn picks. It is worth mentioning that every single one of the picks they got in this deal is unprotected, and that Kevin Durant is 34 years old. Now, getting back to Phoenix, as I mentioned earlier, this does kind of reshape the landscape a little bit in the Western Conference because someone like OG Anunoby's value just went up even more than it already was. This has been talked about already on Twitter and stuff because teams in the West are going to need someone to guard Kevin Durant. And if you're Memphis, if you're Denver, if you're one of these other teams, bringing in OG Anunoby might be even more of a priority now than it was previously. In terms of grades for me, I really feel like if for Phoenix, it has to be at least an A, if not an A+, because if you're bringing in Kevin Durant to a situation where you have a legitimate chance to win a title, which I think that they do, I don't see how it's anything worse than an A. Like, yes, you're giving up all these picks, and yes, you're giving up wings that were critical to your team, but like you needed to make this kind of move if you were Phoenix, or you needed to go completely the other way and fall completely back into some kind of rebuild situation. Yes, it's an old team. You've got Chris Paul and Kevin Durant, guys that are well into their mid to late 30s, but you've got a real shot this year at winning the title. That wasn't the case the day before they made this trade for them. I'm going to give them an A. For Brooklyn, I'm going to give them like a B or a B-. Again, when you're trading away someone like Kevin Durant, it's impossible to get really, really good value on the level of him as an individual player. But getting the future picks, getting two wings that I like in Cam Johnson, Mikal Bridges, I do think that it helps them in terms of checking the boxes, the goals you would want to meet out of a Kevin Durant trade. But when you're trading away Durant, like I can't give you like a great grade whenever you're trading away someone like Durant. And this is now the end of the Kyrie, KD, James Harden superstar experiment. It's crazy that 400 days ago, all three of those guys were on the same team, and now they've all been traded. When you look collectively at what they got in exchange for those guys in trades, it's not fantastic, but it does now allow them to reset this roster and look towards the future and try and figure out what else they can try and do, whether it be in free agency, otherwise over the next couple of seasons, to build a relatively competitive team. So credit to Phoenix, credit to the new owner there for continually being aggressive, for willing to include literally everything that Phoenix possibly could in order to get Kevin Durant. And now we're going to look forward and see who they're able to get in the buyout market, because the rest of their roster does not have a ton of talent, and they need, at least a wing that can kind of guard and shoot. They still need help at the guard spots. That's been the case this whole time. They need a backup big. There's a lot of different things that they still need to figure out on this roster, but obviously you're raising your ceiling and they've got a real shot at the title. And I would argue that if they can get fully healthy, which is another part of this, because Devin Booker just came back from injury, KD is still returning from his knee injury. Once they get fully healthy, I think they've got a real shot and as good a chance as anybody else in the Western Conference to win the title this year. I really think that's the case. If they can find some buyout guys, it's going to be really interesting to see players potentially flock to Phoenix now with KD in this new situation. So that's all the unbiased analysis that I can give you. Now, as a Nets fan, we'll talk about that aspect a little bit. Of course, it's sad. It's unfortunate that all these guys are gone. Like I said, less than 400 days ago, Harden, KD, and Kyrie were all on the same team. A couple of playoffs ago, KD barely steps on the line. I really feel like Brooklyn would have won the title that season had he not stepped on the line. But ultimately, it does feel good to have KD in a situation where he is happy. He can just go and play basketball and have joy in it again and have a real chance to win a title. And I hope he succeeds. I really hope the best for him in Phoenix. And the value isn't awful. I'm back now where I'm comfortable as a Nets fan with a team that isn't really expected to do too much. But then you have these future first-round picks as well. Sean Marks has proven an ability, whether it be Nick Claxton or Cam Thomas, to draft pretty well later on in the first round. So even if it is late first-round picks, this is a team that should be able to capitalize on that level of value. And as I said, there is some level of comfort in the team not just being immediately awful. Like, you can throw out, Dinwiddie, Simmons, Johnson, Bridges, Finney-Smith, all kinds of weird lineups. Claxton, you could go with, Simmons, Finney-Smith, Bridges, Johnson, and Claxton. Just have one giant lineup out there if you wanted to. They could just be basically the Toronto Raptors of the East Coast. There's some interesting combinations here, and I wouldn't be surprised if they're not done making moves now as we go into the final day of the trade deadline. Jay Crowder potentially being moved. Maybe they want to add another scoring guard here. All that stuff is going to be very interesting. It's unfortunate that this is the way that the era ended. But if you were going to trade Kevin Durant specifically this week, which I hadn't anticipated that would be the case, but if you were going to, this is a pretty good return just given the number of assets, and I don't think there's any other team in the league that was a realistic Durant spot that would have been able to step up and trade away this much to Brooklyn and still retain that championship contender level status. And I think for both teams, it's certainly somewhat of a win-win, although, of course, Phoenix, if you're landing Kevin Durant, you're the big winner in the trade.